garbage can at the International Hotel, man. If I can't smell some garbage, I don't feel at home, man, I'll tell you.
No one expected Elvis Presley's voice to return after all these years. Not through a lost recording or a forgotten interview, but through something far more intimate, far more revealing, and infinitely more dangerous to the myths built around him. It came from a diary, a small leather-bound journal that had stayed hidden for decades, tucked away in a private box that even those closest to Elvis never knew existed. And when its pages finally saw the light, the words inside weren't polished stories or carefully managed lines meant for the public. They were raw thoughts from a man who spent his life being everything to everyone except himself. The discovery didn't happen in some grand archive or locked vault. It happened quietly, almost accidentally, during an estate review that had nothing to do with Elvis's personal belongings. A storage trunk, mislabeled and shoved deep into a corner, was opened simply because someone thought it contained old costumes. Instead, on top of a stack of papers and receipts, was a journal with worn edges and a buckle that had nearly rusted shut. At first, no one recognized its significance. It wasn't until the initials EAP were spotted on the inside flap, written in Elvis's unmistakable looping script, that the truth began to surface. What startled the archivists wasn't just that the diary existed, but that Elvis had never mentioned keeping one. He was surrounded by people, yet famously private. He built walls of charm and humor to protect himself, and even those closest to him rarely saw beyond the surface. But here, in his own handwriting, he had quietly recorded the emotions he couldn't share out loud. These pages weren't filled with stories about concerts or fans or fame. They were confessions, quiet fragments of a man wrestling with the weight of being Elvis Presley. The first entries were dated during the mid-1960s, a period often glossed over in public narratives. Elvis was still a star in name, but he felt increasingly disconnected from the world that had once electrified him. On the outside, he played the role everyone expected: the smiling movie idol, the charming heartthrob, the larger-than-life legend. But in the privacy of these pages, he questioned whether he had already peaked, whether the spark that once defined him had dimmed beyond repair. One passage revealed a moment of striking vulnerability. Elvis wrote about walking into a movie studio and seeing a poster of himself on the wall. The smile on that poster, a smile that millions adored, suddenly felt foreign to him. He stared at it and wondered when he had last felt that alive, that free, that certain of who he was. The line that followed carried the weight of a man confronting his own legend. Everyone sees the king. I can't remember the last time I saw Elvis. That single sentence hinted at years of hidden conflict, years where the persona swallowed the person. But what made the diary so compelling wasn't just the sadness. It was the clarity with which Elvis understood his situation. He wasn't delusional about fame or blind to its cost. He knew the world saw him as unstoppable, but he also knew that somewhere along the way, he had become a prisoner of his own myth. He felt trapped between the expectations of fans, the demands of Hollywood, and the relentless pressure of a manager who believed the Presley brand mattered more than the Presley man. Still, even in his darkest moments, Elvis's words carried a quiet hopefulness. He wrote about music the way people write about old loves: tender, nostalgic, yearning. He missed the stage. He missed the electricity of a live audience. And he feared that if he didn't find his way back soon, that part of him might disappear forever. The diary captured a man standing at the edge of a decision he hadn't yet made, torn between resignation and resurrection. What the archivists didn't realize at first was that these early pages were only the beginning. Because as the entries moved forward, the tone shifted. The doubts grew sharper. The secrets darker. Elvis was no longer just reflecting. He was confessing, revealing truths he never intended anyone to see. And one entry in particular would raise questions that would shake the Presley world in ways no biography or documentary ever had. But that revelation didn't appear until much later in the diary. For now, all anyone knew was this: Elvis had written things that were never meant for the public. And once the first page was read, it became impossible not to turn to the next. As the archivists turned to the next cluster of pages, the diary's tone shifted in a way that made the room fall still. If the early entries exposed Elvis's doubts, the middle chapters exposed the quiet battles he fought when no one was watching. These weren't reflections written in calm hindsight. They were snapshots of a man living inside the machinery of fame, trying to understand how much of his life still belonged to him. And almost immediately, these pages pulled the reader into a part of Elvis's world that had always been whispered about, but never truly understood. Elvis wrote about the loneliness that followed him even in crowded rooms. He described sitting at dinner tables surrounded by friends and assistants, yet feeling as if he were speaking through glass. Everyone laughed at his jokes, admired his stories, and waited for his reactions, but few asked how he was holding up. He admitted he didn't blame them. He had mastered the art of appearing invincible. But in the privacy of his diary, he questioned the cost of playing the king every waking moment. He wondered when exactly the world stopped seeing him as a human being with needs and fears, and started seeing him as a living monument who couldn't falter. One entry captured a haunting evening inside Graceland. Elvis wrote about walking through the halls long after everyone had gone to bed. The house, usually buzzing with life, was so silent he could hear footsteps echo against the marble. He described pausing outside Lisa Marie's room, listening to her gentle breathing, and thinking about how desperately he wanted to be present for her. Truly present. Not just the image she would eventually see on album covers or movie posters. He admitted he feared she would grow up knowing the world's version of him better than the man sitting quietly outside her door. The diary didn't linger on these thoughts. It moved with the rhythm of a man who rarely let himself sit in one feeling for long. But within the shifting entries, another theme began to emerge. Elvis's frustration with the forces around him that shaped his life more than he ever admitted publicly. He wrote about the pressure of contracts, the endless cycle of films he didn't believe in, and the sinking realization that nearly every decision affecting his future came from someone else's pen, not his own convictions. He struggled to understand how he became the centerpiece of an empire he didn't feel in control of. One particular passage stood out with startling clarity. Elvis described a meeting where new movie scripts were laid out in front of him. He scanned them, searching for something that stirred him, something that felt alive, something that reminded him of the electrifying freedom he once felt on stage. But the scripts read like recycled versions of the same character: handsome, charming, predictable. He confessed he nodded along politely, offering a smile that pleased everyone in the room, then went home that night and wrote, "They see me as profitable, not passionate. They want a product, I want a purpose." The line carried an exhaustion that ran deeper than fatigue. It revealed a man who feared time slipping away before he reclaimed the part of himself he cherished most. But even in these vulnerable reflections, Elvis didn't simply accept his condition. He pushed back with determination, writing about the routines he wanted to adopt, the energy he wanted to reclaim, the belief that the music could still pull him forward. He spoke of rehearsals that gave him a fleeting sense of clarity, of melodies that ignited something familiar inside him. Those moments mattered to him. They were reminders that he wasn't ready to surrender to the version of himself others seemed to think he had become. And then the diary took a turn no one expected. Elvis began writing about documents he wasn't supposed to see, papers left on a desk, contracts discussed behind closed doors, financial decisions that concerned him but didn't include him. He didn't accuse anyone directly. He simply recorded what he stumbled upon. In one entry, he described finding a stack of papers outlining a deal negotiated in his name, one he hadn't agreed to or even heard about until that moment. He wrote about reading the terms, feeling the weight of disbelief settle over him, and realizing that parts of his life were being handled without his consent. He didn't express anger. What he expressed was betrayal. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but the quiet kind that seeps into the bones. Elvis wondered how long this had been happening, how many decisions had been made for his own good, and whether people believed he had become too distracted, too overwhelmed, or too trusting to notice. The diary revealed a man slowly coming to terms with the uncomfortable truth that influence can slip away long before anyone realizes it's gone. One entry, dated only months before the end of the diary, captured an evening that seemed to crystallize his suspicions. Elvis described sitting alone in his room, listening to muffled voices downstairs. He recognized them, members of his inner circle, people he saw every day. But something in their tone unsettled him. He wrote about leaning closer to the stairwell, not to eavesdrop, but to understand why he heard his name spoken with hesitation. When the voices finally shifted to laughter, it didn't comfort him. Instead, he wrote, "I'm beginning to wonder if they're protecting me or protecting themselves." This wasn't a man unraveling, it was a man awakening. Elvis began questioning alliances he once took for granted. He asked himself who benefited from keeping him busy, who profited from his exhaustion, and who held the most power when he wasn't looking. The diary didn't provide answers, only questions that grew heavier with each page. But toward the final part of this section, he hinted at something deeper, something that tied his fears together in a way that made the archivists pause. He wrote, "There's a truth sitting in this house that no one wants me to find, but it's closer than they think." He didn't reveal what that truth was, not yet, but he connected it to something personal, something he intended to confront. And with that final sentence, Section 3 closed on a tension so heavy it felt like the breath before a confession. As the archivists reached the final pages of the diary, a stillness filled the room. The handwriting had changed, tighter, more deliberate, as if Elvis knew these entries would carry the heaviest truths he had ever written. Every line felt like he was walking towards something he could no longer ignore, something that had lived in the shadows of Graceland and followed him from room to room like an unspoken presence. The revelations didn't begin with accusations or anger. They began with quiet clarity. Elvis wrote about recognizing how much he had allowed the people around him to shape the rhythm of his life. He admitted he trusted too easily, believing loyalty would protect him from manipulation. But here, in these final pages, he acknowledged a painful realization. Loyalty could be used as a leash just as easily as it could be a lifeline. And for the first time, he questioned whether the world he'd built, this inner circle that moved with him and spoke for him, had grown too accustomed to deciding what was best for him without ever asking what he wanted. The turning point came when Elvis described a discovery he hadn't shared with anyone. He wrote about finding a private letter tucked between financial documents, something he believed he was never meant to read. The letter outlined plans for his schedule, his commitments, and his assets in ways that felt disturbingly cold, as though he were not a person but a resource to be managed. He didn't write the name attached to it, but the tone of the entry made it clear the letter came from someone he once trusted deeply. Elvis didn't explode with anger. Instead, he wrote a quiet line that held the weight of an entire lifetime. "They speak of me like a man who has no say." It was a confession that carried exhaustion, not defeat, an acknowledgement of how far he had drifted from the young rebel who once seized destiny with both hands and refused to let anyone shape him. But the diary didn't end in bitterness. It shifted towards something more vulnerable. Elvis wrote about the people he loved, his daughter, his family, the fans who stood by him even when he felt unworthy of their devotion. He wrote about the music that lived inside him, music he feared was slipping away but still flickered when he allowed himself to dream of performing with the fire he once knew. Those final dreams weren't grand plans. They were quiet wishes, moments he imagined where he could stand on a stage and feel like Elvis again, not the image, but the man. As the pages neared their end, Elvis reflected on a truth he had spent years avoiding: the immense strain of living as a myth while privately unraveling as a human being. He didn't blame fame or the world. Instead, he blamed the silence he carried, the silence that kept him from admitting he needed help, needed boundaries, needed a space where he didn't have to be the king every second of his life. He confessed he did not know how to ask for those things without disappointing the people who depended on him. Then, in one of the last entries, he addressed something unspoken in every biography: the emotional isolation that came with being Elvis Presley. He wrote about standing on stage before thousands and feeling a closeness that vanished the moment he stepped into an empty room. He wondered how a man celebrated so loudly could feel so unheard. It wasn't a dramatic lament. It was the quiet truth of someone who had carried more than anyone realized. But the final entry revealed the heart of the diary's weight. Elvis wrote that he had uncovered something about his finances, something that confirmed his suspicions from earlier entries. He didn't write the details, he only wrote his reaction, a mixture of sadness and liberation. And I finally see what's been hidden from me, and now that I see it, I can't go back to pretending. The diary ended not with a confrontation, but with the resolve of a man who knew he needed to reclaim what pieces of his life he still could. There was no final goodbye, no dramatic farewell. The last words were simple, almost a whisper. If anyone ever reads this, I hope they see the man, not the myth. The archivists closed the diary gently, understanding they had just witnessed something rare. The inner world of a legend stripped of spectacle, revealing a soul that had always been searching for room to breathe. Through these pages, Elvis Presley didn't confess scandal. He confessed humanity. And in doing so, he left behind the truth he never spoke out loud. Even the brightest stars cast shadows only they can see. If this glimpse into Elvis's private world moved you, Imagine how many more untold stories shaped the man behind the legend. Share your thoughts below and let me know which hidden chapter of Elvis's life you want uncovered next. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, unseen histories.